Okay, welcome to this tutorial on thinking particles glass shattering. And in this tutorial we're going to talk about drawing particles to actually create this glass shatter effect. And the reason I want to do this is I want to show a really good use for the particle draw operator. And this is something that does come up in production when you're giving an image like what we see here. So it's just a random image of glass fractured, shattered on the internet. And the client gives you an image of what they want the glass shatter to look like. And a lot of times it's very nitpicky about the look of it. So one way to help manage that in the client expectations would be to use ParticleDraw to literally draw over the image that they provide you to get that pattern to look as close as you can. Now you can clearly use Raster to do glass shatter patterns and so forth, radial patterns very quickly. This way you can do it pretty quickly and easily in Thinking Particles, honestly. So let's take a look at it. So I have a box here, which is my window glass, and this is basically like, just a typical, sort of window, thin glass, as you can see here. And then this is just my reference image just on a simple box, so I can see that as I paint with particles. So let's open up Thinking Particles and get into it. Let me resize the window here so we can kind of see what I have going on. Okay, so very simple, this tree here under the master top level. I have import, I have cells, and then I just have a gravity with glass. Alright, very simple. So this tutorial isn't exactly going to be about all the dynamics and all the shattering part, because there's plenty of information about how to do rigid body effects in TP. This is really a good tutorial about getting a glass shatter pattern to match up with a client provided image. So, alright, put this over to the side here. So the first thing we're doing is we're doing an object to particle. We're bringing in our window glass box here, and we're going to instance that shape. I'm going to go ahead and hide it, and I'm sending that to the group called import. Alright. Next thing up, we're going to do a particle draw operator, and what we're going to do, and let me refresh TP here for a second. So when you're using the particle draw operator, a lot of times you'll have your objects hidden like I do right now, and when I use the particle draw operator, it doesn't have like a surface to draw on. So I'm going to unhide everything here and go back to the box that I have here, right, so that I can draw on that easily in the viewport. So just want to point that out as well. So in our dynamic set called pdraw, we're going to go ahead and add a particle draw operator. The particle draw operator is pretty straightforward. I'm going to use the max painter option, and this allows me to paint a count of particles here. So I'll leave it at 5, and I'll give the depth variation of, like, let's say maybe 5, 4, something like that. Just a little bit of variation in the depth of the particles as I draw them. I'm going to send them right into the group called cells, because we're going to use cells in our volume break. I'll let them live for, like, let's say 10 frames just for right now. It's fine. And that's pretty much it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this off to the side here so we can kind of see the particle draw operator and the two images here, the one image and then the box where I'm going to basically paint my particles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on particle draw, and I'm going to click on the box here so I can get my max painter icon here. And if I hold shift and control and drag my left mouse, I can control the radius of my particle drawing. This is a typical Max UI sort of scenario. So I'm going to make it small, and it might be a little bit hard to see in the video. So I'm going to move this particle draw operator all over to the side as much as possible to give me some more screen real estate here. And what I'm going to do is I'm simply just going to basically draw particles right on the surface of this. And obviously the more particles I paint in an area, the denser it becomes with my particles, right? And I can right click, or actually go here to my particle draw and turn that off. And if I go forward and back a frame, you can see we have our cells. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and remove all the particles so that we have no particles right now. And now I'm going to draw the image that we see here. Now I could totally trace over the top of this if I wanted to, but I want to be able to just see this off to the side so you can see what I'm drawing clearly. So I'm going to turn on particle draw here, and I'm going to click on the box, and I'm going to start to rough out this shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of rough in, guess, the center sort of pattern of where the center break is, this area here. And then I'm just going to sort of roughly paint out some particles here. And you can see very quickly here I'm able to get this glass pattern. And let's say I want to do maybe one here. Just kind of roughing in what this is looking like. And of course, you can always go back and paint over the top and redo it or whatever it might be. So let's do this kind of. And now that I have the basic structure of this, let me add a little bit more details in here. And then what I'll do is I'll go ahead and kind of cap off the center bits as well, just so that way when we do fracture this, we'll have a center, area to go to. And I'll just grab a few more particles here. Maybe I'll add a few more here as well, something like that. And just kind of get in there with these particles. Get a little bit denser here in this area. And the cool thing about this is you can literally, like I said, trace over the image. And we're painting with a lot of particles here, so keep that in mind. And one of the things about painting with these particles is that it's allowing us to get really what we want out of this, and then use that to fracture our geometry. So, okay, I'll make a couple of rings in here as well, just to kind of help this a little bit further. Cool. So let's go with something like this. Alright, so now I'm going to turn off my ParticleDraw and back to our first frame and update, and you'll see the particle color changes. So now we are looking at our pattern here. Cool. So now that we have that, what I want to do is, you can see we're going from ParticleDraw to these cells, right? And I have 18,000 particles right now, which is quite a bit for what I'm going to do. So we'll go ahead, in our cleanup rule, we'll get rid of some of these particles. So first thing I want to do is I'm just going to zoom in here on our particles, and you'll see that the particles are off the surface here of our object that we basically drew right on top of, right? So our depth offset here, variation. So now what I want to do, if I go to the top viewport, is I want to offset these particles so that they're actually inside of the volume of our box. So I just want to move them as a whole. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create an operator called particle data operator. So the particle data operator. So this allows me to basically feed in particles to it, right? And I'll expose everything here. So it allows me to control and manipulate particle information like size, age, spin, position, and so on. So I want to manipulate these particles' position, right? So what happens right now, if I go ahead and add a 0.3 in here, and I connect this directly to this particle's position, what's going to happen is I'm going to alter all the particles' position, and they go away. And you might be saying, well, why did that happen? Well, that's happening because all the particles are now down here at 0, right? So if I lift those up, they're up, so on. So what I want to do is I want to take the particle's born position, which is what we drew out on the canvas there, right? I want to feed that into this 0.3 and then feed the output into the position. So when I do that, we're going to get our particle's position here. But what this allows me to do is this allows me to offset. So if I go to the top viewport here, now this allows me to offset these particles, and you can see that, right? So I just want to frame them up so that they're in the center, so that they're going through the volume of our box. Cool. So that's it. Alright, so now we have that. We want to go ahead and start fracturing this stuff. So let me go ahead and resize this. And I'm going to hide this because we don't no longer need to see that. And we don't need to see our box anymore. So let's hide that. And I'm going to resize the window. Great. Okay, so we're done with particle draw at this point. So now what we want to do is we want to clean up our particles a bit, because using VolumeBreak with this many particles as our cells is going to be problematic and slow. And we don't want that. We don't actually need that. We just want this pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here to black boxes, and there's a black box that comes with thinkingParticles under helpers, I believe. Let's see here. Maybe it is under conditions. Let's see. What do we have here? Maybe it's under conditions, curves, helpers, math. Where the heck is this thing? Ah, sorry. It's under the default black box. So if you go to your black boxes, and here we have in here %particles. So you want to just drop that down onto your dynamic set. And what this allows you to do is, I'm just going to go ahead and disconnect all this stuff here. And what this allows you to do is this allows you to take some particles, in which case is going to be the cells, and randomly it allows you to take a percentage of them, right? And we're going to take, let's say 95% of them, we're going to delete them. So we're going to use a particle die. So we'll feed that to our cells, and the on is from our threshold. So that basically now will mean that we are going to kill off everything but 5% of our particles, right? Because we're using 95% of them to die. Okay, and we'll change this later, but we go from 18,000 down to 962 particles. Okay, so let's say we're going to start with 80% of them to be dead. So that leaves us 20% of these particles, which is 3,500. So let's go and do 85. That gives us, let's see, that gives us 2,700 particles. Okay, cool. So let's start with that. And you can see here we still have our basic pattern, right? Cool. So we're going to let VolumeBreak do the heavy lifting on this. Alright, so now that we have that, what we're going to do is we're going to take a dynamic set called VB, which is going to be our VolumeBreak rule. We're going to take our import, which is our box, and we're going to create a VolumeBreak rule. So let's create a VolumeBreak operator. And I'll expose the on, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn this on at like frame 2. The reason for that is that allows me to just plug this in, and when I scrub my timeline, I don't have to get bogged down by VolumeBreak or anything like that by mistake if I scrub my timeline. Of course, these are things that you would normally just implement depending on what you're trying to do. So this tutorial is just about getting this glass pattern. So I'm going to set the output that VolumeBreak creates to our glass, which is our gravity here. So that way these particles, they'll just become affected by gravity. Alright, straightforward. So I'm going to resize our window here, because now at this point we're going to talk about VolumeBreak for a little bit. So let me move this over here so we can kind of see what happens here. I'll turn on edge faces as well, so we can see what happens with VolumeBreak as we manipulate this a little bit. Okay, so we go to frame 2 now. We can see our VolumeBreak happens. So let's go down to the most important part down here. So our raster size. So let me set this to like 12. Okay, so you can see we have broken pieces. Now the smaller I make this, obviously the more refined the VolumeBreak becomes. And the thing about that is it certainly gives you the opportunity to adjust and see what the overall size will be when you're using this raster. And in our case, we have a specific pattern that we want to create here. So we want to use our cells, which is an option in VolumeBreak here, which just takes particles. And our particles are called cells because it makes sense. So what I'll do is I'm going to change this raster up to like 15, just so we can see some big broken chunks here. And I'm going to change the density to like 1250, and I'm going to cap our max chunks to, like, let's say 900 particles for our max chunks. And what that is going to do is when I switch this to cells, it's going to use the cell pattern that we've created, which you can already see it's using that pattern to create our volume broken pieces here. So I'm going to go ahead and hide for a second here, just our master dynamic here. I'm going to hide our dots so that we don't see them, so we can just see the pattern that's being created here. So the cool thing about this is new in this latest version of thinkingParticles is we have the option to take our cells and merge them together with the raster size. So if I go back to none, you'll see our normal raster size, right? And as we bring this down, you know, we get more detail, right? So let's bring this back up to something like 12. I'm going to turn on merge with cells, and I'm going to switch to cells. So when I turn off merge with cells, you'll see that the outer ring is going to change in its pattern. Turn this off, right? So you can see we're getting the pattern here and the detail from what we did with our particle draw. And when I turn on merge with cells, you can see it's changing the outside pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to lower this, and you're going to see as we do that what this is doing to the outside shape here of our particles. So it's kind of cool that you can combine both of them, because sometimes if I go back here and let's go to our cleanup rule here. So right now we're killing off a lot of particles here. So if I go back to our 95%, so that leaves us with hardly any particles, you'll see the pattern changes a bit. And as I increase the accuracy of our particles, we get more detail. But then the outer ring, which normally, without our checkbox here for merge with cells, the outside ring is kind of just these long, straight, you know, kind of ugly lines. Especially in this section here, you can see there's like just not a great pattern. So it's nice to turn on your raster size to break all this excess out here on the outer edge of this pattern that you just made. But you have to be careful with it, because obviously the more chunks you have that get created here, so if I make 1500 chunks as my max cap for volume breaking here, it can be a lot slower. So, you know, you kind of got to keep that in mind when you're dealing with volume breaking and doing this kind of effect. What's cool about this too is you can also use, for activation, you can use your cells as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to our percentage of particles. Let's bring this, actually let's bring this up to 90, and that way we're only using 10% of these particles. And I'm going to go to my volume break here, and I'm just going to change the raster size a bit as well. And what I'll do now is let's go up to our activation, and we're going to use also for activation, let's go ahead and use our group called cells. So what we'll do is we'll make a smaller percentage here. There's 10% for our threshold here. Let's do like a 0.5, something like that. And you can see what's cool about that is it's also allowing you to use the pattern that you drew with the particle draw for activation, which is pretty cool. So you know, you can see that these particles now are falling with gravity. Cool. So it allows you to do a really cool glass pattern shatter effect using particle draw to really sculpt the way this pattern of your glass that's broken should behave as far as the fracturing goes. And then you can also use those exact same cells to activate it if you wish. In this case, make this a little bit smaller, so we're only activating smaller pieces and shards and whatnot. But like anything else, you can also activate this in any other way with point helpers, velocity, impact objects, whatever you want to do. But the bottom line of this tutorial was to talk about how you can get a glass shatter pattern very quickly by just using particle draw and tracing over an image, or specifically trying to get a pattern that you want. And then also the use of combining it with the cells merged with raster is another option when you're working with this inside VolumeBreak. So you have a lot of options to kind of use when you're working with this. And then, of course, a good rule is to go ahead and set up some kind of way to clip out some of these particles when you're drawing, because you're not going to need to have that many particles when you're creating this sort of effect. So as I start to lower this, we're going to get more of a detailed pattern, but as you can see here, volume break, because I'm limiting the amount of chunks that's happening here in volume break, that we're not getting enough detail on this side, so to speak, right? So again, using merged with raster will help, you know, these areas fill out as well, so you can kind of, you know, just play around with what works. And obviously this is telling me I'm capping my max chunks here, because these are not filling out down here in this side as we're seeing the details over here, because there's not, I'm capping my the max that I'm allowed to volume break during this operator right now. So again, it's volume breaking, so you got to make sure that as you can see now, it's slowing down because I'm introducing a lot more chunks here. But like I said before, you know, you can always go in here and you can adjust a lot of things, and you know, again, adjusting your particle counts here will definitely speed up the whole process for sure, and also allow you to just, you know, maybe art direct this a little bit more and so on. So it's a really cool way to get these glass shatter patterns, or a pattern that is very specific, by using the ParticleDraw operator in order to really define these really cool patterns. So one last thing here is I'm going to bring this up to, let's say, 80%, and I'm going to go ahead and volume break. I'm going to cap our particle chunks as well. So let's cap this at 650, so we're going to see a different pattern here, right? Like 800, 250, 400, something like that. So let's do that. And our density, let's make this 2500. Okay. And then I'm going to adjust our raster out on the outer ring as well, just so we can kind of see what's going on here. Cool. So what I want to do too is another thing that's really cool about doing glass now with volume break is the pieces that get activated, which let me activate just a few of them just by going up to the top and doing, let's say, 25% of them to be active. And let's just do center negative, so the ones in the center, center negative. Okay, cool. And just so we can kind of see that. So what I want to do is let's go ahead and give them a little bit of force. So in volume break here, let's give them some speed just so that they move out a bit so we can see their edges. Cool. So now that we have the ability now with doing glass like this, we can also set up a rule for doing, and I'm going to turn off right now our edit on the fly. We can create a rule for shape noise. So let's, and again, I would do this after you cache your dynamics, but let's take a look at shape noise on these glass shards. So our glass group will add a shape noise operator, and our shape noise operator is going to only affect ID2, because in volume break by default material ID2 are the edges that we see here, and that's what we want to add noise to. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say material ID2, and let's change this to relative bounding box, and let's go ahead and connect this up, and let's scrub forward a few frames. Okay, so our volume break is creating now shape noise on the edges, and obviously we just need to make some adjustments. First of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to zero out the intensity. I'm going to turn on tessellate so we can see some tessellation on the edges, and let me turn on the edit on the fly so that way we can see real-time updates. Okay, so we see that it's tessellated now, right? Alright, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to adjust the shape noise. So first thing I want to do is I want to bring up our intensity just so I can see what is going to happen here with 0.1. Okay. So I'm going to set this to normal, so it's using the normals. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the object is fine. I'm going to decrease the scale here and start to increase the scale until I see some good behavior going on here on these edges. So I'm going to increase the intensity a little bit. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the top and turn on the fall off, because I want a sharp edge and I just kind of want the inside of that to be messed up, kind of what we're seeing here now along this edge here. So that's the stuff that I'm looking for along this edge. So increase our fall off to, let's say, a 0.5. We don't really see much. 0.1, 0.05, cool. 0.01, 0.03, 0.05 is probably what I want to use. And then I can adjust our intensity just so I can see it a little bit more exaggerated. And our scale here is going to control either how big or how small this is. So I want it to be like a larger noise pattern, you know, so it's not small. And then once I have a larger sort of pattern of noise going along the edges here, then I'm just going to tone down the intensity. And then that's going to give me a little bit more detail along the edges of these objects when they shatter, which is going to be quite nice on the edges of the glass that we see here. So I'm going to close this for a second. So that's going to give us a nice little edge detail on our glass. And the one thing in here is the center of this chunk right now is got a lot of artifacts going on, so just need to go into VolumeBreak and adjust that. So let's open up, not VolumeBreak, but actually we just need to adjust our shape noise a little bit here. So I'm going to go with 3 iterations, just give a little bit more detail. And I'm going to make, let's say, our X factor, I'm going to zero that out for a second. I want to see how that affects everything. Okay. Because I only want the edges to be roughed up here, which I'm getting already by doing that. So that seems to be pretty good. And that's kind of the edging that I want to see along the glass. So I can also add a little bit of the waterline as well, which is kind of doing what the fall off does. It erodes the edge a little bit, which might be kind of nice on glass edges. So that'll just give you a better glass edge on your glass pieces. And again, you don't want to use typically a really rough, you know, shard edge. You kind of want what we're seeing here. We're seeing larger hills and valleys sort of along the edge on these pieces. That's a good example of the glass break sort of edge that you see on glass, I guess. But you know, all glass is break in different ways, so lots of options here. Same thing, you can also turn on auto smooth, but since it's glass and you want it to refract in interesting ways, I wouldn't really probably turn on auto smooth for the glass. I'd actually probably leave that off just so we'd get some interesting refraction happening from hard edges. And maybe I'll turn down the waterline just a little bit here as well. And yeah, so that's the last thing I would do. Would add a little bit of that edge noise here using shape noise into our pattern, and you know, that gives us a nice little edge detail on the glass fracture. So that's really it. Hopefully you found something interesting here in this tutorial about ParticleDraw and thinking particles to create glass shattered patterns. Thanks.